All right, good. So we have 4 objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to do these 4 things. If by the end of class you cannot do these 4 things, and I failed you as a teacher, I'll do my best. Please do your best. Okay. Would somebody like to read number 13, please? Thank you, Scotty.
Identify key turning points in the war in the Pacific.
Yes, we're going to talk about some turning points in the war today. A turning point is sort of a classic history teacher kind of thing. Like, when does it look like the storyline is progressing one direction? What brings about the change? What's the turning point? Would somebody like to read number 14, please? Thank you, Joshua.
Outline the offensive moments of Americans in the Pacific.
Yes, we're going to talk about offensive movements. Now, I want to make sure that we're talking about the offensive parts of the war, not the offensive movements of the war. I mean, I'm sure that there were people who were offensive, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, like, offense. Would somebody like to read number 15, please? Thank you, Monica. Yes, today we're going to talk about the atomic bomb. Talk about like how it develops, and it's the first time it's used. Would somebody like to read number 16, please? Thank you.
Describe the challenges faced by the Allies in building a lasting peace.
Yes, at the end of World War II, there's a strong feeling like we can't have happen again what happened in World War I. We'll talk about kind of how that goes down. Yeah.
By this time, were they calling the Great War of World War I?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. Good question. All right, so let's begin in Roman numeral number 13. Okay. Get on my right pages of notes here. You'll remember from our last class that Pearl Harbor was what drags America into the war, but our first real battles of the war were not really against Japan, even though that's what brought us in. The Allies had agreed that defeating the Nazis was the first priority. And so the United States did not significantly significantly attack Japan until after VE Day, after Victory in Europe Day. It's not like we were totally not fighting in the Pacific, but to really put our effort into it, the first step was the Nazis. So Japan attacked the United States in 1941 at Pearl Harbor and laid us a pretty tough blow. I mean, more sailors were killed in Pearl Harbor in a 2-hour attack than American sailors in the whole of World War I. It also really decimated our battleships. Most of our whole Pacific fleet was in port at Pearl Harbor, so when it gets attacked, we took a hit on our boats. However, most of our submarines survived, and all of the aircraft carriers were out at sea. So some of the other pieces were spared, but the battleships, the destroyers, they got hit hard. Subpoint B. In the first 6 months and the years after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had ended up conquering an empire which would dwarf Hitler's Third Reich. It's a little hard to compare because as Japan goes and takes new land, they're taking islands across the Pacific. So they don't actually take if you're just flipping through the map, it doesn't look like there's much dirt. It looks like mostly they're taking water of the Pacific Ocean. But they did take major land holdings in what today we would call Southeast Asia and East Asia, into China, into French Indochina, to Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaya, Burma. There were some pretty major land holdings, and then, like I said, dominating large swaths of the water. They also swept south and east across the Pacific, conquering the Dutch East Indies, Guam, Wake Island, Solomon Islands, and a whole bunch of little outposts that don't look like they amount to very much. American and Filipino forces found themselves attacked in the Philippines. This guy here on the right, Douglas MacArthur, he's almost always depicted this way with his big aviator sunglasses, and he's often smoking a pipe. And MacArthur smoked a kind of a peculiar pipe, that long stem, and then the barrel of the pipe is a cob of corn, like somebody has eaten corn and they like hollowed out the cob to make a pipe out of it. Is it Frosty the Snowman had a corn cob pipe, right? Like that was the thing. They're not very common today. I mean, pipe smoking in general is not very common today. But MacArthur, his was kind of peculiar, and it kind of became his signature. MacArthur was kind of a weird dude. He was very robotic. A lot of people didn't even think of him as like a human. I'm pretty sure he was, but he was not like everybody else. He had like kind of strange speech patterns, and he was just a real arrogant son of a gun, which probably, to go be one of the most important generals on earth, you probably have to have a kind of a swagger. You probably have to have a little bit of an arrogance to you. And MacArthur did all. We'll talk more about MacArthur in a minute. But so MacArthur is stationed in the Philippines, and when the Japanese invaded the Philippines in 1941, MacArthur had to retreat, and American and Filipino forces basically found their backs to the sea. And so Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave. And as he left on March 11th, 1942, MacArthur leaves the islands with his wife, his son, and his staff. And this is such a MacArthur line. He looks to the people that don't leave and he says, "I shall return." Right? I mean, who talks like that except MacArthur does? I'll be back. Right? Like, I shall return. That's his parting lines to the Philippines in 1942. So that would have been in March of 1942. In April of the same year, the United States tried to go take a raid on Japan. And what becomes known as Doolittle's Raid, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led a daring 16-bomber attack on Tokyo. December 7th, 1941 is Pearl Harbor. 5 months later, we go and fly a bombing raid on Tokyo. It's not really the same scale of the attack, but it boosted American morale. It's like, yeah, we're not just going to take it, we're going to fight back where we can. So the Doolittle's raid on Tokyo a few months later, putting a Pearl Harbor style air raid over Japan, it lifted America's sunken spirits, and it took Japan down a peg. It's not a significant battle, but it's like the first strike against Japan. Subpoint D. The Battle of the Coral Sea took place. So this square outlines kind of the theater of the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the main Allied forces in the Pacific are the Americans. We take most of the fighting forces of the Pacific, Americans, and the Australians. The British had pledged to fight with us in the Pacific, and the Soviets had pledged to fight with us in the Pacific. But frankly, they are in such bad shape after the Nazis that they don't play a significant role. They're there, they're a tactical position, but they don't play a significant role for us. Most of the fighting is done by the United States and the Australians. So the Battle of the Coral Sea is a Japanese advance towards Australia. Okay, I don't know if you have a mental picture of Australian geography in your head, but let's go ahead and give it to you. It looks like a dinner plate, right? That there is sort of a ridge and then kind of a flat part across the middle. It is mostly desert with kind of like green circle. So this is the Great Barrier Reef, okay, right? It's the big coral reef. It's up on this side of the island. And then most of the people in Australia live in about an hour's drive from the sea right up here. There is some population over on this side, but most of the interior of Australia is pretty empty. There's not much in there but kangaroos and, Crocodile Dundee. Okay, so when the Japanese go and attack into the Coral Sea, they're going after the population center of Australia. That's kind of what we're looking at there. And let's see, train of thought. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, most of the fighting was done up in the air. It's almost like a dogfight battle. They launched no missiles from ships. Not a single shot was fired from a surface ship. It's almost all air combat in the Battle of the Coral Sea. What's successful about the Battle of the Coral Sea is that it's the first time that a Japanese invasion is stopped. Up to this point, the Japanese take everything they want. The Battle of the Coral Sea, air battle, which stops the Japanese advance, at least in Australia. So that's kind of the first. If we're looking for turning points in the war, we've got a couple of pieces that look like turning points. The bombing raid over Tokyo, it's more of like a moral victory than a huge tactical victory. But the Battle of the Coral Sea is like stops the advance. Roman numeral number subpoint E. Japan's next thrust was towards an island called Midway. I actually even have a hard time finding it on this map because it's not clear. Midway is not a real big island. We're going to go ahead and get out our globe here. Hawaiian Islands, Japan, and about midway between them is an island called Midway.
Oh, I see it.
And it's a little tiny speck in the middle of nothing. There's almost nothing there. Yeah, I have not. I hear it's good, but I don't see many movies.
I tried to see it, but I only got midway through.
Oh, you! Oh, okay. Japan's next threat was towards Midway. Midway is strategic. Okay, so we got to kind of put ourselves in the 1940s, and airplanes are a much better technology than they were in World War I, but they're still not like flying over the Pacific is a huge ask of 1940s airplanes. By the end of the war, we've got the technology to start thinking about jets, but this is like propeller airplanes, and so places to land your plane, to refuel, those become pretty important. And Midway was seen as one of those. It was a tactical position. It's not like anyway, Japan's next thrust towards Midway. Americans had broken the Japanese code. We were basically reading their transmissions. And we knew that Midway was to be the next target. So Admiral Nimitz, the American naval forces in the Pacific, moved to go defend the island. That's June 3rd of 1942. His scout planes find over the Japanese fleet. The Americans then sent torpedo planes. So a torpedo plane is like a bomber, but instead of just dropping the bomb, they drop a torpedo, which would go hit the water and then try to take a boat out from under the water. And pretty successful. The Japanese were caught with their planes still on the aircraft carriers. Basically, we got them by surprise, and they didn't even have a chance to launch up a counterattack. The results were devastating. By the end of the Battle of Midway, the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, 250 planes. And in the words of a Japanese official, the Americans had avenged Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway, I think, is the first thing we can really call a significant turning point in the Battle of the Pacific. Because it's the time where we had taken a major victory over the Japanese, the Battle of Midway. After that, the Allies began a series known as island hopping. So the Japanese land holdings were all these little speckled islands all over the Pacific. And there was more, the Japanese had more islands than the Allies could really go take again. So we just basically, we don't need to get them all. We can't get them all. There's too many to get. So what they called island hopping, they would go take one island and go attack it and then fly over other ones and just totally skip some other islands. They might be significant. They might be landing strips and a pretty fair amount of airplanes on them, but we're just going to totally skip it and go to another one. And we were going to hop our way across the Pacific, go take a new island, use it as a launching base for the next move. What's called island hopping, and it's the battle plan after the Battle of Midway. Roman numeral number 14. The first Allied offensive began in August of 1942 when 19,000 troops stormed Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese had to abandon Guadalcanal 6 months later, and by the time they had abandoned it, they called it the Island of Death, because basically the Allied troops were jumping out so fast on the Japanese there. Guadalcanal marks Japan's first defeat on land. We had fought them in the air at the Battle of the Coral Sea. We had taken them taken out their fleet from above at Midway, but Guadalcanal marks the first land victory for the Allied troops. And then they continued, the Americans continued moving across the Pacific towards Japan. In October of 1944, 1,780 Allied troops converged on Leyte Island in the Philippines. MacArthur comes back, and this is such a MacArthur thing to say. People of the Philippines, I have returned. And again, you can find which one's MacArthur right away because he's out front and he has the aviator sunglasses and he just looks like a real tough piece of wood. Subpoint B. The Japanese sent their entire fleet into the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They also tested a new tactic called the kamikaze. A kamikaze is a Japanese word. It means the divine wind. It's an old legend in Japanese society that in the year 1281, during the Middle Ages, the Mongols, like Mongolia, what's like northern China-ish, right? Mulan, right? The Mongols were going to go invade Japan, and then this typhoon blew up, the divine wind, and blew the Mongol invaders off, and it was like the gods were protecting Japan. That word, kamikaze, the divine wind, also became the name of the style of air battle, where a person in a fighter plane would go and try to shoot its target, try to launch whatever missiles it's got from its target, and then, having shot all of its ammunition, turns the plane itself into a missile to go crash into its target. It's a suicide mission. The kamikaze pilot will die every time. And the Americans couldn't figure this out. Like, wait a minute, what in the world? You'll sometimes hear in American history a battle referred to as a suicide mission. If American soldiers have ever been ordered into actual suicide, I don't know it. I mean, I guess it could happen, but I don't know it. Sometimes you hear the term suicide mission because they're going into a battle that they won't win. I'm reminded of, during the Civil War, of Pickett's charge. The Pickett had to go Pickett Southern commander has to go charge up a hill, like into fire being shot down, like the Union troops were shooting down on him as he is advancing up. And it's referred to as Pickett's mission. Pickett's charge was a suicide mission, but it wasn't like Pickett said to any of them, "You go kill yourself," right? The kamikazes are. Those are actual suicide missions where they're expected to go shoot every bullet in the plane and then go die in the next effort of crashing the plane into the side. Okay, looks like Reagan's closed her eyes. I need everybody to stand up for 1 minute. Okay.
Ray, you were talking about people blowing up. How could you not?
Okay, so the kamikazes, suicide missions, in the Philippines, 424 kamikaze pilots embarked on suicide missions. And this totally confused the Americans. Like, how in the world would the emperor do this? But the emperor had promised that the Japanese would fight to the last man. And this was how they were going to do it, to the last man. Every single person was considered a part of the army. Despite the kamikazes, you can go ahead and get this in your notes. Besides the kamikazes, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a disaster for Japan. Overall, it was not effective. In 3 days of battle, Japan lost 3 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 500 planes, 424 of which I think were kamikazes. From then on, though, this basically takes out the Japanese Imperial Navy. You may be seated. This takes out the Japanese Imperial Navy, who played then only a minor role after that. Subpoint C. Subpoint C. After retaking much of the Philippines and liberating the American prisoners of war there, the Allies turned to the island of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is an awful place. It's a little island described as an ugly, smelly glob of cold lava in a surly ocean. It is active. There's earthquakes. It also smells like sulfur all of the time. It's like a hell island, right? There's all these like little caves on it. Some of them are natural caves, but it's also like the perfect rock for tunneling or something like that. And the Japanese defended it fiercely because it was a significant air base for them for launching. Iwo Jima is not a pretty place. It might look pretty in the photo. People like all say it's a gross and disgusting, smelly, awful thing. But it was also the site of terrific carnage. Just amazing. And the word amazing makes it sound like a compliment. I don't mean it that way. It's an awful, awful place. It was maybe the most heavily defended spot on Earth, with 20,700 troops entrenched in tunnels and caves all around the island. So Japan has 20,700 soldiers on this little island to go defend its air base. When the Americans take it, we lost 6,000 Marines. It's one of the bloodiest venues for American soldiers in the whole of World War II. We lost 6,000 people taking Iwo Jima. The greatest number of any battle in the Pacific to that point. But this is crazy. Of the Japanese, only 200 of them survived the Battle of Iwo Jima. It's an incredible lopsided loss for the Japanese. Basically hiding it takes like 6 months. They were like guerrilla warfare, running out of caves and ambushing American soldiers, and some of the most horrific scenes of battle were on this little awful island. But they also talk about like the bombs would go and cave in the hiding places, and they would just lose 1,000 people in a cave at one time as they were able to blow the cave up. It's just crazy. Battle of Iwo Jima, when you see the picture, maybe the most iconic photo of all of World War II, the flag raising over Iwo Jima, when you see this picture of these U.S. Marines raising that flag, that is a hard-fought victory, and it has come at a price for both sides to go raise that flag.
How many people did we have sent in?
How many Americans did we take? I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't know what the size of our invasion force was. We'll look that up here in a little bit. It also means that Iwo Jima was such an important launching base that there was only one more goal to take before attacking Japan itself, and it's the island of Okinawa. In April of 1945, U.S. Marines invaded Okinawa. So here's Okinawa right here. It's this sort of long, small island right there. If you've seen Karate Kid 2, the one where they go back to Mr. Miyagi's island, that's Okinawa. That's where he's from. Okinawa is a distinct island. It's distinct from the rest of Japan. Japan is the 4 big islands. There's about 1,000 smaller islands that surround it that are all Japanese islands. Okinawa is the one that's geographically distinct. Like its plants are different, its land is different, and its culture. It's Japanese, but it's Okinawan Japanese. It's a little different kind of model out of it. And in April of 1945, U.S. Marines invaded Okinawa. The Japanese unleashed more than 1,900 kamikaze attacks, almost 2,000 kamikaze attacks on Americans in the Okinawa campaign, with a fair amount of success, sinking 30 American ships, damaging 300 more, and killing almost 5,000 sailors. Once ashore, though, once the Americans get ashore, they faced even fiercer opposition than Iwo Jima. By the time the fighting ended, in June 21st of 45, 7,600 Americans had died trying to take this island. The Japanese, though, paid an even sharper price, having lost 110,000 people in defending the island, including 2 generals who chose ritual suicide over the shame of surrender. So, it's not super cool, but it's like...
No, I said so.
Seppuku. They just said super cool. I was like, we don't talk about that as okay. So if you're an American commander, you're looking at this and you're like, holy cow! In 2 islands of Iwo Jima and of Okinawa, the Japanese have lost over 130, almost 140,000 people. And they're still fighting. It's like the Emperor's threats to go fight to the last man. They freaking mean it. I mean, basically every man in Japan was part of the army or draftable in part of the army. And the Emperor was going to fight until he was out of them. So it's crazy. General Douglas MacArthur, I want to revisit MacArthur here. He was not considered like a regular guy. A lot of times, soldiers, even like generals and commanding officers, they don't want to be buddies with the people they command because they have to give an order and expect to carry it out. But they usually want to be like seen as part of the team. MacArthur didn't. He was just too weird. He was too arrogant. Your book describes him as prickly. There's just no way you could ever think of him as a common guy. But he was a brilliant strategist. I made a comparison another hour. Like Dr. Rapp and I are friends. But our friendship changed when he became the principal because he might have to fire me one day, right? And so like we have a friendship, but it has to be a professional level of friendship. MacArthur wasn't friends with anybody. He was just the commander. But was brilliant, and maybe among the most brilliant military strategists ever. Americans got killed, but for every single American soldier who died in battle, the Japanese lost 10. I mean, those are staggering numbers. Those are staggering numbers. He was considered a real hero of the war, both by the military, the people that fought for him, and the people that fought along beside him, and also by the prisoners on the Philippines whom he freed. Douglas MacArthur, strange dude, but a brilliant general. Roman numeral number 15. Taking Iwo Jima and Okinawa opened the way for a full-on invasion of Japan. However, we looked at how bloody Iwo Jima and Okinawa had to be and said, my goodness, if we go and try to take the big islands, this is going to be carnage. And we think we can beat them, but it's an awful way to beat them. The Japanese know that they will lose this battle, but they don't have to win it. They just have to, I'm going to reset this sentence. The Japanese know that they can be beaten, but they don't have to win. They just have to not lose. So the Japanese can play defense and keep losing tens of thousands of people in battle, but they just have to outlast American resolve. And at some point, do we say, yeah, we got them and go home? Right? We called for the Nazis' unconditional surrender. Would we keep carrying out an unconditional surrender in Japan if we start piling up losses in the tens of thousands as well? So that's kind of the Japanese calculation for invading the islands themselves, the 4 big islands. President Truman basically said an invasion is going to be terrible. And there's only one way that he knew of to avoid the invasion, and that's the atomic bomb. At its peak, more than 600,000 Americans were working on the atomic bomb. There was over 500,000 people working in various parts of the project. Although most people didn't know what they were working on, or they had one small segment of a much bigger project. It was one of the largest scientific projects ever in the history of man, but also incredibly secret. I mean, they had 600,000 people on it. Most people had no idea really what they were working on. They're just working on science, right? It was so well kept that Harry Truman, as vice president, had no idea we had an atomic bomb until Roosevelt died. Roosevelt and Truman didn't get along, and they didn't hang out, and they didn't talk about the battle at all, which was weird because Roosevelt was dying, and like you should have invited in the next guy, but like it just had no relationship. So when Truman becomes president, they're like, here's the keys to the White House. Oh, by the way, we can end humanity. You want to know about it? That's the atomic bomb. The first test of the atomic bomb took place in the morning of July 16, 1945, in an empty part of the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico. There's nothing in Alamogordo then, or especially now, and it was an incredible explosion. The first thing was the flash, the blinding flash, and you could see the flash of the explosion from 180 miles away. 180 miles away is about, okay, so Kansas is a rectangle. Kansas is about 200 miles tall. So almost the height of Kansas away was how far you could see this flash. That's a big flash. Okay, Kansas is just about 200 by 400 miles. We're about a 2x4 state. There's some rounding in there, but just about. So 180 mile flash, and then the shock wave. The shock wave sometimes does as much damage as the actual explosion. So atomic bombs have 3 basic things that destroy. The first one is the actual explosion, the boom itself. The next is the shock wave, which is the moving air from the explosion. So if you've ever had to pull over your car on the side of the highway and feel a semi-truck drive by you, you know how your car kind of shakes? That's the shock wave. But imagine it happening not on the size of a semi-truck, but on the size of an atomic bomb. We can't imagine it. But it's like the shock wave is also destructive. There are videos, not from the Alamogordo attack, so I didn't include them in here, but like some of the ones that happened in Nevada, the explosion goes off and then the shock wave, they had built a house just to see like what would withstand it. And the shock waves come and just rips the house apart into pieces on it. The explosion itself is destructive, the shock wave is destructive. And then the third wave is the radiation fallout. All of the nuclear dust that goes and settles down afterwards, and that's a much slower, more agonizing death. So Truman now has a difficult decision. Should the Allies use the bomb to bring an end to the war? To go drop an atomic bomb on a city means that there will be a lot of civilian casualties, people who are not fighting. You know the phrase, all's fair in love and war? That's actually not true for either one of them. There are rules from war. There's considered like fair combatants and unfair combatants. Civilians are unfair. They're not part. But to go attack in Hiroshima and Nagasaki means that you're going to go kill civilian lives. Truman has to face this decision. And he knows a couple of things. He knows that in a total war like Japan was fighting, there are no civilians. They would have drafted every single person on the island. They're all ultimately combatants. And he also knows that they can attack here without losing a single American. And Truman considers this calculation, and he says, he right away says the atomic bomb is a fair weapon to use and we'll use it. He addresses it pretty quickly. On July 25th, 1945, okay, so Alamogordo took place on July 16th. 9 days later, Truman sends a message to the Emperor of Japan and says, surrender at once or face prompt and utter destruction. To our eyes today in 2020, you can look back at this and you say, Japan, surrender! Don't, like, you're not going to win this, surrender! But you also have to remember the eyes of 1945. This was a secret project, nobody knew that we had it, and this sounds like the kind of bluster that people say in a war. Oh, we're going to totally annihilate you, absolutely. Like, there's, right, like, it doesn't sound like a real threat. Japan knows that if the Americans go and invade the islands, the carnage will be bad, and that Americans may lose their heart for it before they win. So Japan refused. Truman wrote, the final decision of where and when to use the atomic bomb was up to me. Let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubts that it should be used. On August 6th of 1945, a B-2 bomber named the Enola Gay released an atomic bomb. It was codenamed Little Boy over the town of Hiroshima. Basically, they have to fly this bomber. It's, propellered airplane, flying at a really high height, reach their target, open the door, and drop the bomb, and then just like hit the gas on the plane and fly out as fast as they can. Because they have to be clear from the blast. They have to be clear of the shock wave. They got to go. 43 seconds later, the entire city collapsed. Almost every building in the city turned into a pile of dust from the force of the blast. 1 minute Hiroshima existed, and the next minute it's gone. It's just gone. Hiroshima was a middle-sized town. There's nothing particularly significant about it. There was a military base nearby. There was military bases everywhere. It was not a particularly important city for its population, anything else. It's just a city. Just a city with a base nearby, but most of the cities have a base nearby. Japan, though, didn't surrender after dropping the first bomb at Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb, this one codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki and instantly leveled half of the city. That was in August. By the end of that year, just a few months later, an estimated 200,000 people, a fifth of a million, died from injuries and radiation poisoning caused by the atomic blast. Emperor Hirohito was horrified by the destruction brought about by the bomb. He said, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." So he ordered them to draw up papers to end the war. This is him here with Douglas MacArthur, who's not wearing his sunglasses, so he may not be recognizable. On September 2nd, 1945, formal surrender ceremonies took place on the USS battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Okay, let us move to Roman numeral 16. And we got to kind of pick up a storyline in Europe again. Let's got to go pick up a storyline in Europe. Germany is going to face division into 4 categories. Yeah, they're going to division into they're going to quarter the city, and different countries are going to run over it, or they're going to run it. I'm going to run over it. They're going to run Germany. But Germany had to pay another price for its part in the war. When the Allies discovered the Nazi death camps, people were horrified. I mean, the concentration camps, the work camps, people knew about those. There was rumors that they were also death camps, of just slaughtering as many people as they could. But to discover them was just a different level of awful. And so they want to go hold people accountable. But it gets tricky because everything they did was legal under German law. Nothing's illegal. If you're going to go take people to court, they have to have committed a crime, and all of this stuff was legal. But it just felt like it's so wrong, that there's a different level of crime here. It's not a crime against the law. It's a crime against humanity. In the city of Nuremberg, it's a city kind of on the southern edge of Germany, they convene these trials. They're known as the Nuremberg Trials. And it's kind of an odd sense of justice. They feel like there should be some kind of trial, but they've got to kind of make it up a little bit. The Nuremberg Trials are not perfect justice. There's kind of today I think we would do it differently. But nothing really existed to go try these crimes. 24 defendants. Hitler's most trusted party officials, government ministers, military leaders. 24 were tried. 12 of them were sentenced to death. And most of the rest died in prison. In lesser trials of leaders, nearly 200 more Nazis were found guilty of some types of war crimes. Some people say that these didn't go far enough, that there was a lot of Nazis that went free. People who participated in the killing, but that they walked free. The Nuremberg trials were imperfect. I think everybody agrees on that now. But it did establish an important principle. And that is that people are responsible for their own actions, even in times of war. You heard people say over and over again that they were just following orders. Actually, they said it so many times it became known as the Nuremberg defense. The person says, well, I was ordered to go do those things. And the Nuremberg defense still stands as it's not a real thing. You still have an obligation to follow your correctly formed conscience. It's not enough to say you were following orders. This is true in Nuremberg. This is also true, by the way, just right now in your life. You can't follow an unjust order. I don't think I'm ever going to ask you to do something wrong. But if I do, don't listen to me. You have no responsibility to follow an unjust order. And that became established. The Nuremberg defense is not a defense. It may mitigate your punishment to say I was following orders, but it doesn't excuse you. You can't do the wrong thing even if you're told to. So point B. Japan was occupied under U.S. forces under the command of Douglas MacArthur. In the early days of the American occupation of Japan, more than 1,100 Japanese officials, from the prime minister to lowly prison guards, were arrested and put on trial. 7 were sentenced to death. In the Philippines and in China and other Asian battlegrounds, additional Japanese officials were tried for various atrocities against civilians or prisoners of war. We occupied Japan for 7 years. In the 7-year occupation, MacArthur totally reshaped Japan. You kind of imagine Japan was a feudal country. I mean, they had an emperor and like almost medieval. I mean, it wasn't medieval, but it's still kind of a feudal law until MacArthur comes in 45 and basically says, we're going to set up a new, kind of a Japanese version of America. He reshaped their economy. He basically says, we're going to take American-style capitalism. We're going to take American-style democracy. The emperor, Hirohito, he's going to stay the emperor, but you don't have to listen to him anymore. He's not divine. He's not a god. You don't have to listen to him. There is still an emperor in Japan. They're a figurehead. They're actually even less important than like the Queen of England. But he exists. He runs around Japan. But has no real power. MacArthur also called for a new constitution, which would go and guarantee like women's right to vote and civil rights protections. In America, we watch what MacArthur's doing in Japan. They're like, dude, he's like just rewriting the large sections of the Japanese Constitution are cribbed almost exactly from the American Constitution. It's like we did a cut and paste wherever it said United States, but Japan. Like otherwise, it's like they're very similar constitutions. The New York Times reported General MacArthur has swept away an autocratic regime by a warrior god and installed in its place a democratic government presided over by a very human emperor based on the will of people as expressed in free elections. The Japanese today, they still use this constitution. They actually call it the MacArthur Constitution because he was the author of it. He's the James Madison of Japan, although it's cribbed from the American Constitution. So I guess James Madison is also the James Madison of Japan.